The Angevins, (Andvns), were an English royal house in the 12th and early 13th centuries. Its monarchs were Henry II, Richard I, and John. In the 10 years from 1144, two successive counts of Anjou, Geoffrey and his son, the future Henry II, won control of a vast assemblage of lands in Western Europe that would last for 80 years and would retrospectively be referred to as the Angevin Empire. As a political entity, this was structurally different from the preceding Norman and subsequent Plantagenet realms. Geoffrey became Duke of Normandy in 1144 and died in 1151. In 1152, his heir, Henry, added Aquitaine by virtue of his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry also inherited the claim of his mother, Empress Matilda, the daughter of King Henry I, to the English throne, to which he succeeded in 1154 following the death of King Stephen. Henry was succeeded by his third son, Richard, whose reputation for martial prowess won him the epithet Coeur de Lion, or Lionheart. He was born and raised in England but spent very little time there during his adult life, perhaps as little as 6 months. Despite this, Richard remains an enduring iconic figure both in England and in France, and is one of very few kings of England remembered by his nickname as opposed to regnal number. When Richard died, his brother John, Henry's fifth and only surviving son, took the throne. In 1204, John lost the Angevins' continental territories, including Anjou, to the French crown. The loss of Anjou, from which the dynasty is named, is the rationale behind John's son, Henry III of England, being considered the first Plantagenet, a name derived from a nickname for Geoffrey, where no distinction is made between the Angevins and Angevin era and subsequent English kings. Henry II is the first Plantagenet king. From John, the dynasty continued successfully and unbroken in the senior male line until the reign of Richard II, before dividing into two competing cadet branches, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Terminology: Angevin. The adjective Angevin is especially used in English history to refer to the kings who were also counts of Anjou, beginning with Henry II, descended from Geoffrey and Matilda. Their characteristics, descendants in the period of history which they covered from the mid-12th to early 13th centuries. In addition, it is also used pertaining to Anjou, or any sovereign government derived from this. As a noun, it is used for any native of Anjou or Angevin ruler. As such, Angevin is also used for other counts and dukes of Anjou, including the three kings' ancestors, their cousins who held the crown of Jerusalem, and unrelated later members of the French royal family who were granted the titles to form different dynasties, amongst which were the Capetian House of Anjou and the Valois House of Anjou. Angevin Empire. The term Angevin Empire was coined in 1887 by Kate Norgate. As far as it is known, there was no contemporary name for this assemblage of territories, which were referred to, if at all, by clumsy circumlocutions, such as our kingdom and everything subject to our rule, whatever it may be, of the whole of the kingdom which had belonged to his father. Whereas the Angevin part of this term has proved uncontentious, the empire portion has proved controversial. In 1986, a convention of historical specialists concluded that there had been no Angevin state and no empire, but the term espèce Plantagenet was acceptable. Origins: the Angevins descend from Geoffrey II, Count of Gapon and Ermengarde of Anjou. In 1060, this couple inherited, via cognatic kinship, the county of Anjou from an older line dating from 870 in a noble called Angelga. The marriage of Count Geoffrey to Matilda, the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I of England, was part of struggle for power during the 10th and 11th centuries among the lords lords of Normandy, Brittany, Poitou, Blois, Maine and the kings of France. It was from this marriage that Geoffrey's son, Henry, inherited the claims to England, Normandy and Anjou that marks the beginning of the Angevin and Plantagenet dynasties. This was the third attempt by Geoffrey's father Fulk V to build a political alliance with Normandy. The first was by marrying his daughter Matilda to Henry's heir William Adelin, who drowned in the wreck of the White Ship. Fulk then married his daughter Sibylla to William Clito, heir to Henry's older brother Robert Curthose, but Henry had the marriage annulled to avoid strengthening William's rival claim to his lands. Inheritance custom and Angevin practice. As society became more prosperous and stable in the 11th century, inheritance customs developed that allowed daughters to succeed to principalities as well as landed estates. The 12th century chronicler Ralph de Diceto noted that the counts of Anjou extended their dominion over the neighbours by marriage rather than conquest. The marriage of Geoffrey to the daughter of a king occurred in this context. It is unknown whether King Henry intended to make Geoffrey his heir, but it is known that the threat presented by William Clito's rival claim to the Duchy of Normandy made his negotiating position very weak. Even so, it is probable that, should the marriage be childless, King Henry would have attempted to be succeeded by one of his Norman kinsmen such as Theobald II, Count of Champagne, or Stephen of Blois, who in the event did seize King Henry's English crown. King Henry's great relief in 1133 at the birth of a son to the couple, described as the heir to the kingdom, is understandable in the light of this situation. Following this, the birth of a second son raised the question of whether custom would be followed with the maternal inheritance passing to firstborn, and the paternal inheritance going to his brother, Geoffrey. According to William of Newburgh writing in the 1190s, the plan failed because of Geoffrey's early death in 1151. The dying Geoffrey decided that Henry would have the paternal and maternal inheritances, while he needed the resources to overcome Stephen, and left instructions that his body would not be buried until Henry swore an oath that once England and Normandy were secured, the younger Geoffrey would have Anjou. Henry's brother Geoffrey died in 1154, too soon to receive Anjou, but not before being installed Count in Nantes after Henry aided a rebellion by its citizens against the previous lord. The unity of Henry's assemblage of domains was largely dependent on the ruling family, influencing the opinion of most historians that this instability made it unlikely to endure. The French custom of partial inheritance at the time would lead to political fragmentation. Indeed, if Henry II's sons Henry the Young King and Geoffrey of Brittany had not died young, the inheritance of 1189 would have been fundamentally altered. Henry and Richard both planned for partition on the deaths while attempting to provide overriding sovereignty to hold the lands together. For example, in 1173 and 1183 Henry tried to force Richard to acknowledge allegiance to his older brother for the Duchy of Aquitaine, and later Richard would confiscate Ireland from John. This was complicated by the Angevins being subjects of the kings of France, who felt these feudal rights of homage and the right of allegiance more legally belonged to them. This was particularly true when the wardship of Geoffrey's son Arthur and lordship of Brittany was contended between 1202 and 1204. On the young king's death in 1183, Richard became heir-in-chief, but refused to give up Aquitaine to give John an inheritance. More by accident than design, this meant that, while Richard inherited the patrimony, John would become Lord of Ireland and Arthur would be Duke of Brittany. By the mid-13th century there was a clear unified patrimony and Plantagenet empire, but this cannot be called an Angevin empire as by this date, Anjou and most of the continental lands had been lost. Arrival in England. Henry I of England named his daughter Matilda heir, but when he died in 1135 Matilda was far from England in Anjou, Maine. while her cousin Stephen was closer in Boulogne, giving him the advantage he needed to race to England and have himself crowned and anointed King of England. Matilda's husband Geoffrey, though he had little interest in England, commenced a long struggle for the Duchy of Normandy. To create a second front, Matilda landed in England during 1139 to challenge Stephen, instigating the civil war known as the Anarchy. In 1141 she captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln, prompting the collapse of his support, while Geoffrey pushed on with the conquest of Normandy over the next 4 years. Matilda threw away her position through arrogance and inability to be magnanimous in victory. She was even forced to release Stephen in a hostage exchange for her half-brother Robert, 1st Earl of Gloucester, allowing Stephen resumed control of much of England. Geoffrey never visited England to offer practical assistance, but instead sent Henry as a male figurehead, beginning in 1142 when Henry was only 9, with a view that if England was conquered it would be Henry that would become king. In 1150 Geoffrey also transferred the title of Duke of Normandy to Henry but retained the dominant role in governance. 3 fortuitous events allowed Henry to finally bring the conflict to a successful conclusion. In 1151 Count Geoffrey died before having time to complete his plan to divide his inheritance between his sons Henry and Geoffrey, who would have received England and Anjou respectively. Louis VII of France divorced Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom Henry quickly married, greatly increasing his resources and power with the acquisition of Duchy of Aquitaine. In 1153 Stephen's son Eustace died. The disheartened Stephen, who had also recently been widowed, gave up the fight and, with the Treaty of Wallingford, repeated the peace offer that Matilda had rejected in 1142. Stephen would be king for life, Henry his successor, preserving Stephen's second son William's rights to his family estates. Stephen did not live long and so Henry inherited in late 1154. Henry faced many challenges to secure possession of his father's and grandfather's lands that required the reassertion and extension of old suzerainties. In 1162 Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, died, and Henry saw an opportunity to re-establish what he saw as his rights over the Church in England by appointing his friend Thomas Becket to succeed him. Instead, Becket proved to be an inept politician whose defiance alienated the king and his councillors. Henry and Becket clashed repeatedly over church tenures, Henry's brother's marriage and taxation. Henry reacted by getting Becket and other members of the English episcopate to recognize 16 ancient customs governing relations between the king, his courts, and the church, in writing for the first time in the constitutions of Clarendon. When Becket tried to leave the country without permission, Henry attempted to ruin him by laying a number of suits relating to Becket's time as Chancellor. In response, Becket fled into exile for 5 years. Relations later improved, allowing Becket's return, but soured again when Becket saw the coronation of Henry's son as co-regent by the Archbishop of York as a challenge to his authority and excommunicated those who had offended him. When he heard the news, Henry said, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nurtured and promoted in my household, who let the Lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" 3 of Henry's men killed Becket in Canterbury Cathedral after Becket resisted a botched attempt to arrest him. Within Christian Europe, Henry was widely considered complicit in Becket's death. The opinion of this transgression against the Church made Henry a pariah. So in penance he walked barefoot into Canterbury Cathedral, where he was scourged by monks. In 1171 Henry invaded Ireland to assert his overlordship, following alarm at the success of knights he had allowed to recruit soldiers in England and Wales who had assumed the role of colonizers and accrued autonomous power, including Strongbow. Pope Adrian IV had given Henry a papal blessing to expand his power into Ireland to reform the Irish Church. Originally this would have allowed some territory to be granted to Henry's brother, William, but other matters had distracted Henry and William was now dead. Instead, Henry's designs were made plain when he gave the lordship of Ireland to his youngest son, John. In 1172, Henry II tried to give his landless youngest son John a wedding gift of the three castles of Chinon, Loudon and Marlborough. This angered the 18-year-old young king who had yet to receive any lands from his father and prompted a rebellion by Henry II's wife and three eldest sons. Louis VII supported the rebellion to destabilize his Henry II. William the Lion and other subjects of Henry II also joined the revolt, and it took 18 months for Henry to force the rebels to submit to his authority. In Le Mans in 1182, Henry II gathered his children to plan a partible inheritance in which his eldest son would inherit England, Normandy and Anjou, Richard the Duchy of Aquitaine, Geoffrey Brittany, and John Ireland. This degenerated into further conflict. The younger Henry rebelled again before he died of dysentery, and in 1186, Geoffrey died after a tournament accident. In 1189, Richard and Philip II of France took advantage of Henry's failing health and forced him to accept humiliating peace terms, including naming Richard as his sole heir. 2 days later the old king died, defeated and miserable in the knowledge that even his favored son John had rebelled. This fate was seen as the price he paid for the murder of Becket. Decline. On the day of Richard's English coronation there was a mass slaughter of Jews, described by Richard of Devizes as a Holocaust. After his coronation, Richard put the Angevin Empire's affairs in order before joining the Third Crusade to the Middle East in early 1190. Opinions of Richard by his contemporaries vary. He had rejected and humiliated the King of France's sister, deposed the King of Cyprus and sold the island, insulted and refused to give spoils from the Third Crusade to Leopold V, Duke of Austria, and allegedly arranged the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat. His cruelty was exemplified by the massacre of 2,600 prisoners in Acre. However, Richard was respected for his military leadership and courtly manners. Despite victories in the Third Crusade, he failed to capture Jerusalem, retreating from the Holy Land with a small band of followers. Richard was captured by Leopold on his return journey. He was transferred to Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, and a 25% tax on goods and income was required to pay his 150,000 mark ransom. Philip II of France had overrun Normandy, while John of England controlled much of Richard's remaining lands. However, when Richard returned to England he forgave John and re-established his control, leaving England permanently in 1194. Richard fought Philip for 5 years for the return of holdings seized during his incarceration. On the brink of victory, he was wounded by an arrow during the siege of Château de Chalas-Chabrol and died 10 days later. His failure to produce an heir caused a succession crisis. Anjou, Brittany, Maine and Touraine chose Richard's nephew Arthur as heir, while John succeeded in England and Normandy. Philip II of France again destabilized the Plantagenet territories on the European mainland, supporting his vassal Arthur's claim to the English crown. Eleanor supported her son John, who was victorious at the Battle of Marlborough and captured the rebel leadership. Arthur was murdered, and his sister Eleanor would spend the rest of her life in captivity. John's behavior drove a number of French barons to side with Philip. and the resulting rebellions by Norman and Angevin barons ended John's control of his continental possessions, the de facto end of the Angevin Empire, although Henry III would maintain his claim until 1259. After re-establishing his authority in England, John planned to retake Normandy and Anjou by drawing the French from Paris while another army attacked from the north. However, his allies were defeated at the Battle of Bouvines in one of the most decisive battles in French history. John's nephew Otto retreated and was soon overthrown, with John agreeing to a 5-year truce. Philip's victory was crucial to the political order in England and France, and the battle was instrumental in establishing absolute monarchy in France. John's French defeats weakened his position in England. The rebellion of his English vassals resulted in the Magna Carta, which limited royal power and established common law. This would form the basis of every constitutional battle of the 13th and 14th centuries. The barons and the crown failed to abide by the Magna Carta, leading to the First Barons' War when rebel barons provoked an invasion by Prince Louis. Many historians use John's death and William Marshall's appointment as protector of 9-year-old Henry III to mark the end of the Angevin period, and the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. Marshall won the war with victories at Lincoln and Dover in 1217, leading to the Treaty of Lambeth in which Louis renounced his claims. In victory, the Marshall Protectorate reissued the Magna Carta as the basis of future government.